If you type in the name Madeleine West into IMDb, you'll see an acting career spanning over almost 2 decades with several notable movies and TV shows to her name. However, little do you know that probably the most important and demanding role of her life came in the year 2022, and it wasn't for any movie or show. This is the story of how actress Madeleine West went undercover with the help of investigation officers to catch a serial pedophile who had physically assaulted her and several other children in the neighborhood over the span of more than 10 long and agonizing years.
And I said to Scott, I can't do this. And this one said to me, just act, Madeleine. Just act like you're a woman seeking justice. And then it just felt like jumping off a waterfall.
Early life. Well, before actually going into the details of this case, let me tell you something about Madeleine's life. So like most people in the showbiz business, Madeleine isn't her real name. She was born as Melanie Ann Weston on 26 July 1980 in Melbourne, Australia. However, the family quickly moved to the small Victorian town called Woodend, where she received her early education from Woodend Primary School. Now, Madeleine's stepfather was an engineer, so the family had to move quite frequently because of his job, and that's why Madeleine made it through high school by attending 8 different schools all over Australia. Now, Madeleine had always shown keen interest towards acting, music, and throughout her childhood she had taken part in various plays and theatres. Even during her university years, she was a permanent part of the drama club, and after getting a degree in law, she completely turned her attention towards acting as a career. In 1999, she finally came into everyone's attention as an actress by joining the cast of hit soap opera Neighbours, a show that has all featured the likes of Russell Crowe, Margot Robbie, Guy Pearce, and several other notable actors. Now, more than 2 decades later, she still continues to be a successful actress in Australia. However, this isn't what we are going to talk about today. A scarred childhood. Amidst all the glitz and glamour, there was something that had been constantly bothering Madeleine over the years. Wherever she went, whatever she did, she just couldn't shake that horrible memory down. She hadn't told anyone about this, but as more and more time was passing, it was becoming difficult for her to stay silent. And finally, in the year 2017, she decided to speak up. But the question here is, what this horrible memory was, and why was she so scared to talk about it? Now, as I have already mentioned, Madeleine had spent the early years of her life in a small Victorian town called Woodend. During her childhood in Woodend, her next-door neighbour was a fellow named Peter Vincent White, who worked as a plumber in the area. Peter was widely known as a lovely, friendly guy whose house was kind of a playground for neighborhood children, including Madeleine. According to Madeleine herself, his house was a magnet for kids. He had the pool and the sandpit and was the first person on the streets to have a VHS player. So kids were drawn to that house, and we were regularly babysat in that house. Now, mind you, that having 2 children of his own and a wife, Peter was a family man in the eyes of the whole town. However, there was a sinister secret behind all of this, a secret that Madeleine revealed a lot later. The fact that Peter's wife, who was supposed to actually babysit the children, was almost deaf, and it made it a lot easier for him to go on with his evil deeds for more than a decade without ever getting caught. You see, when Madeleine was just 5 years old, she started going to Peter's house. In the beginning, it was all innocent, with Madeleine playing in their garden with all her toys and having a fun time with the neighborhood kids. But things soon took a horrific turn when Peter started getting close to Madeleine. It began with inappropriate touching and feeling, but as the time passed, Madeleine suffered several counts of sexual abuse from Peter Vincent White, abuse that was often disguised as games by Peter. According to Madeleine, some of these games included playing with his private parts or dressing it up with ribbons or flowers and touching it in a specific way. More than often, there were more than one kid in the room touching him, and him being a pillar of that society gave him complete confidence about not getting caught. And sadly, he was right. This went on for more than 5 years, and according to Madeleine, one time she even told her parents about the inappropriate touching. But being quite a young couple, they had absolutely no idea on how to deal with this situation, and as a result, they did absolutely nothing about it. I know, it's surprising. After some time, Madeleine and her family moved away because of her stepfather's job. Madeleine, while talking to 60 Minutes interviewer, revealed this horrific memory of her childhood, saying, "The abuse started when I was 4.5 and continued on until I was 10. All I knew was what it was like to be raped when you're a little girl and how much it hurt and not wanting any part of that." Quest for justice. Decades later, in 2017, Madeleine finally gathered the courage to face her past and report this crime. However, as the crime had occurred in the 80s and there was complete lack of any form of evidence, nothing really happened for over 2 years, and it seemed that this case, like thousands of others, would end up in a random file cabinet. But then an unbelievable coincidence occurred. Amanda Lee, who was Madeleine's childhood friend from Woodend, filed a separate police complaint accusing White of sexual abuse. Now, both Lee and Madeleine were unaware of each other's complaints, and both of them had never shared this horrific reality with each other. So after receiving 2 different complaints about the same person, investigating officer Scott Tuddenham started his quest to gather more and more evidence about this case. While talking about this case to 60 Minutes, Scott told that it was just abhorrent, disgusting, horrific, calculated, intentional offending. There were some factors you don't come across too often. I was really intrigued to find out what else was there. Catching the predator. After the investigation began, Scott was able to find more and more people who had suffered the same way as Madeleine but stayed quiet all these years. With more and more interviews, the pile of horrific crimes done by Peter had become quite large. However, in order to take the case to the court, police needed some strong evidence or a confession. So Scott and other investigators decided to lure Peter in and get a confession. For this purpose, Madeleine West was chosen. Now, being an actor, Madeleine was the obvious choice to act and get a confession from White. But facing your abuser even after all these years is never an easy thing to do. Scott himself, while talking during an interview, told, "Using Madeleine for getting a confession was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking." Madeleine, on the other hand, talked about this choice as, I can't do this, and then this one, Scott said to me, just act like Madeleine. Just act like you're a woman seeking justice, and I went, okay, and then it just felt like jumping off a waterfall. So after weeks of training and elaborate planning, Madeleine, who was 44 years old at this point, was fitted with a secret recording device by Detective Scott Tuddenham on the morning of 13 July 2022. More than 30 years had passed since she had last seen Peter, and a part of her was still scared. But she had to do this for her sake and for the sake of several other children like herself. So, the goal was simple: go to his house, surprise him, get him to talk, and record a confession. After all the necessary proceedings, Madeleine was taken to Peter's house. She knocked on the door and waited. After a while, the door opened, and here he was, right in front of her, after more than 30 years. While talking to 60 Minutes, Madeleine described this encounter as, "The door opened, and in that moment, I had my gotcha moment because his face dropped. I knew he was waiting. He had been waiting for this day for 30 or 40 years."
And the door opened, and in that moment, I had my gotcha moment because his face dropped, and I knew he'd been waiting for this day for 30, 40 years.
After some time, Madeleine went straight into the conversation and told him about all the things that he had done to her and several other children in front of her. At first, Peter got confused, saying, I don't understand. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me or telling me." But when Madeleine repeatedly pressed him, he gave in. According to Peter, he didn't remember doing anything to Madeleine, but he didn't deny it either, admitting it was a possibility that he might have abused her when she was a child. "I don't remember doing anything like that. I'm sorry, please forgive me if I did. I don't remember. I'm very sorry if I did."
I'm sorry I put you through any of this, darling. I really am.
Thank you, Peter. That means so
I really am.
The final judgment. With this all-important confession with them, Madeleine and Scott were ready to get justice, and the case was presented in court. In addition to Madeleine and Amanda, 5 other people were ready to present themselves in court and make sure that their abuser finally gets what he deserves. In November 2022, Peter Vincent White was charged with several counts of abuse and sexual misconduct. A year later, in December 2023, the court proceeded full of reporters and families of victims. But the thing that happened next was exactly opposite of what everyone was expecting. After listening to all the charges against him, White actually pleaded guilty to all 33 of them. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole for next 9 years. Many people would describe White's last decision as a decision made to lessen his remorse and guilt. However, in the eyes of Madeleine, he didn't have any remorse, and him getting caught was the only guilt he had. All of the victims in the court were asked out to read their victim impact statements, and Madeleine's statement ended as, "You ruined my life, and now I'm handing that back to you. You take it back to that prison cell, and may you rot." Do let me know your comments about the video in the comments section. Till then, adios.